Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth, its sacrament, and service, its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. Amen.
Please grace this time.
Last February, I was out in Arizona on sabbatical and just finishing up the first half of my training in spiritual direction. I rented a car and I drove from Tucson to Los Angeles. I was chasing an original new opera and an ancient Greek myth. I'd become kind of obsessed with the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, which you may remember from your high school unit on the Greek gods and goddesses. And you may remember that Orpheus was a demigod musician, the son of a muse, whose wife, Eurydice, was bitten by a snake on their wedding day and sent into the underworld. Orpheus charmed his way into the palace of Hades, the god of the underworld, and begged him to bring his wife back to the living world with him. Hades was moved by the grieving musician's words and song, and he agreed, but with one condition. Orpheus had to travel the path back to the living world walking in front of Eurydice. If at any point in the journey he turned around to check to see if she was following, his beloved would return forever to the world of the shades. The myth of Orpheus and Eurydice was the plot of the Broadway hit Hadestown, which I had seen in July. And I chased this myth to London at the beginning of my sabbatical in November, where I researched ancient Orphic rites in a medical library and attended 3 operas based on the Orpheus myth. Orpheus has been having a moment, you see, and I was swept into it. I've always loved Greek myths and Greek tragedy. They do not end with redemption or with happy endings. They just stay where they are. They acknowledge the tragic element of existence that Americans so want to avoid and are so terrified of. At the beginning and at the end of Hadestown, the narrator, Hermes, sings, "It's a sad song. It's a sad tale from way back when. It's a sad song, but we're going to sing it again." So I drove out west about 500 miles, and I stayed with close friends, and we saw the wonderful new opera Eurydice at the Los Angeles Opera Company. And then I drove back toward Arizona, stopping at the Grand Canyon along the way, wind in my hair, marveling at the vastness of the land and reveling in the desert stillness. My sister had called me when I had been in my last days of the spiritual direction program. Our mom was sick. She had had a cardiac crisis of some kind. It was touch and go for a couple of days. Things weren't really medically clear, but the signs looked pretty good, and my sister did not think that I needed to fly back east immediately. And then Mom stabilized. We were relieved. Karen said, "Finish your trip, get back east, and then you can go visit Mom in March." We just took things for granted. We started hearing about COVID-19 right after I got back to Massachusetts, but it was sort of for me a background noise of concern. Certainly, I assumed it would be handled in that vague way that one presumes those in charge or the experts will get a handle on a public health emergency. So almost immediately when I got back, I drove to see my sister in Connecticut, and we attended a theatrical production of Jane Eyre at the Hartford stage, making grim jokes about people coughing down the row in our seats. Karen was a bit nervous, but I reassured her, "Don't be paranoid." I had started to research flights and make plans to fly down to Charlotte, North Carolina, to visit Mom in South Carolina. and to support her for the next phase of her care, which sounded like it was going to be going to rehab. And then we were starting to have a discussion about her and my stepdad moving to an assisted care facility. Don, my stepdad, is 95, and we thought it would be a good idea for the both of them, and they were both amenable. My mom and I were not getting along at the time, but I knew, nevertheless, it was my turn to be the helpful kid, as my brother and sister needed and deserved a break. Do you remember those blurry days of mid-March 2020? I remember it. I've described it as being like the scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indiana Jones is being chased by that boulder at the beginning of the film. It just keeps coming. There I was unpacking from my trip out west, picking up my dog who'd been cared for by friends, checking airfares to North Carolina, sorting through weeks of mail, and sort of following concerning news that was popping up about the pandemic. The Biogen conference came into the news, but I was still naively not worried. An author's lecture I had planned to attend at the Harvard bookstore was postponed and then canceled. And then suddenly it's not safe to fly, which was very alarming. And I thought, my God, am I going to have to go on a road trip all the way down to Mom's? So I started planning that. And then it's not safe to leave this state. And then in a quick succession of days, it's not safe to leave the house. Do you remember how disruptive and shocking this was? The panicked scramble to deal with your kids suddenly pulled out of school, workplaces evacuated with no knowledge of when it would be clear to return, even to gather personal belongings. Within a few days, I contacted the church staff to check in with them, and Michael Salona, our board president. The board had wisely decided to close the church. I contacted Claire Wilson, our pastoral care coordinator, and our guest worship leaders. I remember asking Art McDonald if he knew anything about technology and leading worship online, and he said, "No, Vicki, I hate to dump this on you, but I don't know anything about tech." And I told him, "Please don't be silly. This is not anything anybody prepared for." He had been scheduled to do the coming services in March and then also to lead the Easter service on April 12th. I concluded my sabbatical early and got back to church. Do you remember how frightening it was? We were wiping down our mail, and I remember frantically looking in my medicine cabinet for rubbing alcohol and masks that I had stashed there when doing some home repair projects. That haunted feeling of disbelief I remember feeling when going into a grocery store for the first time and seeing that odd sight of everyone in masks with big nervous eyes, many of us also wearing gloves, spraying our hands with sanitizer every few minutes. So anxious when anyone got within 6 feet of me. The empty shelves of toilet paper. I will remember that time as being incredibly silent as the curtain of social isolation descended, but also strangely chaotic. Everyone was scrambling around. We didn't know how we were going to do anything, but we needed to reassure each other. Clergy groups and COVID resource church groups and how-to groups sprang up all over. We all learned about Zoom. Remember when you'd never heard of Zoom? Suddenly, live streaming and YouTube channels and video editing software and digital church and virtual congregational life and social distancing and Zoom programming became part of my lexicon, a bewildering and overwhelming landscape, And I know that every single one of you had your own version of this in your own lives. Meanwhile, my mother was doing okay. My stepsister Carol and my sister and I were figuring things out over the phone about rehab and assisted living, and then Mom began to die. The hospital called us, and all of us kids got on the phone together to talk to her. She was very weak, but she laughed when we sang Bushel and a Peck to her. She died a couple of days later, on March 25th, my sister's birthday, her firstborn. I don't know why we didn't expect it at all, but somehow we really didn't. Shirley had never been seriously sick, and the shock was great. It was a shock upon shock. And suddenly I became part of the story of the millions of people who lost a loved one during this pandemic and could not be with them when they died, could not keep vigil in the hospital, could not travel to be with them, could not touch them, could not cry together with my siblings, could not sit in silence and grieve with those who intimately understood. Nobody went out for deli platter. No one said, "You sleep in Mom's bed, I'll take the couch," as they did the dance of the visiting bereaved adult children. I could not go anywhere. I could not be with anyone. 3 weeks later, my dear friend Michael became worried about me and came into my house at a risk to both of us. He walked through the door in a mask, and I threw a blanket over him so that we could hug somewhat safely. We mourned over text, my family and I, and my mother's best friends. We mourned over Marco Polo app, Zoom, and FaceTime, and through old-fashioned letters and cards. I posted photographs of Mom for 40 days on Instagram in a weird social media version of the Eastern Orthodox mourning tradition, which is also observed in Islam and in some forms of Buddhism. I created a hashtag, 40 Days of Shirley. It helped. I would not wish this deprivation on my worst enemy. Rituals of mourning, I've come to understand, are a sacred trust between the living and the dead that broke my heart to breach, even though the situation could not be helped. Surely my mother understood, I knew, as I trusted that surely all the COVID dead would forgive the absence of the customary or the greatly postponed rituals and rites on their behalf. Surely, I prayed, heaven and peace eternal would not be denied any soul who departed this life unwitnessed by those who best knew and loved them. And I gave thanks every day and still do for all the medical professionals who fulfilled that role for so many. I learned that it is the living, not the dead, who become abandoned to a kind of hell under these circumstances. And so it was that I, who had been totally absorbed for the previous year in an ancient story about a man who sojourns to actual hell to retrieve his beloved wife, found myself in an underworld time of grief, deprived of the customary comforts and consolations, and quite utterly bereft. Without anywhere to go, anyone to see, with, thank God, church work and church life and ministry to help keep me on a somewhat even level, but feeling such longing from my family that I hurt physically. I found strangely helpful companionship with a group of ancient Greek philosophers I admired for a long time, the Stoics. They're much misunderstood and their philosophy very oversimplified, but I am a fan, and I had been listening for a while to a podcast called The Daily Stoic and appreciating the core virtues and tenets of Stoicism, some of which are to meditate regularly on our own mortality, memento mori, to understand that it's not our situations that make us miserable, but really the way we choose to think about them that does, to maintain a reverence and gratitude toward life under all conditions, to not get caught up in interpersonal drama, and of course the four cardinal Stoic virtues of courage, temperance or moderation, justice, and wisdom. If you've ever wondered what is inscribed on this pendant I've been wearing all year, those are the words, one on each side. When I felt myself skidding into emotional despair, I sent myself to my easy chair in the corner to practice deep, calming breathing and to immerse myself in the old wisdom from the men I began to think of as my dudes. The playwright Seneca the Younger, the 2nd century Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, an unremarkable Greek man who lived as a slave for 30 years and influenced generations of people with his wisdom. I turned to other calming, wise people too, poets and wisdom teachers, but it was my Stoic dudes who proved the most helpful at companioning me through my very worst days, who helped me to keep my pain in perspective, and who were steady friends and advisors despite their distance of chronological time and the veil of death.
From the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Upon every accident, keep in view those to whom the like has happened. They stormed the event, wondered and complained. But now, where are they? They're gone forever. Why should you act the part? Leave those unnatural commotions to fickle men who change and are changed. Yourself, take thought how you may make good use of such events. Good use for them there is. They will make matter for good actions.
As a Universalist, I have never considered anyone's sufferings a punishment from God. Life is a school, in my opinion, and we're here to grow a soul, a growth that the early Universalists believe could continue in the world after this one. Imagine my sense of fellowship with Seneca the Younger, a Roman Stoic philosopher who lived in the 1st century, when I read these words of his from On the Happy Life.
The cross encounters of fortune we are not to look upon as a cruelty, but as a contest. That part is strongest which is most exercised, and the tree that is most exposed to the wind takes the best root.
Things happen, my dudes kept reassuring me. Plagues happen. People die. Dogs die. Emperors come into power who are psychopaths. As Seneca knew, he was himself forced by the Emperor Nero to kill himself. And he did. Meanwhile, we have choices every moment of every day about how to think about things, teach the Stoics. And through practice, we can order and orient those thoughts to maximize gratitude and gain equanimity in times of sorrow, confusion, and suffering. It's an old song. It's an old song from way back when. It's a sad song, but we're going to sing it again. How interesting that the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice reemerged in the art scene as almost a trend just a year before a global pandemic. This story that acquaints us with the inevitability of death, and the transcendent power of love. How coincidental, or not, that I had spent the year before the pandemic following every retelling of this story that I could find in the theater, in opera, in literature, in poetry, tracking productions all the way across the ocean, and later driving 500 miles across the desert to see this story reenacted. Through this reacquaintance with the ancient Greeks and their deep wisdom about life and the end of life, I found again three old guides, three life coaches, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, who through the mists of time offered me, and all of us, a torch by which we can better see through the shadows cast by circumstance. I will let Epictetus have the last word. Don't seek for everything to happen as you wish it would, but rather wish that everything happens as it actually will. Then your life will flow well.